tonight we are going to be talking about removing barriers in gifted education. And we have with us Nisia Patalan. She is starting her 44th year as a gifted human being and 22nd year in education, 14 of which she's spent working with gifted learners. She is committed to equity and identification. I've been working with her for several years on this common goal we have in the state of Colorado, and loves busting myths about gifted education. So we are super excited to have Nisia on tonight, and I'm just glad to be seeing my friend from all the way across the state. Fair warning, there are some weather disturbances happening on my end. We've got some wind and storms coming in over here, and she's all the way over near Durango, and she's been having snow. So if it gets a little glitchy, bear with us, hang in there. We've got some great stuff to talk about tonight. So Nisia, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. There is some definite snow happening. So it's my worst nightmare to get stuck with my face frozen in a funny position, but that might happen for us tonight. Let me go ahead and get my slides pulled up here. Okay, so tonight I'm going to be talking about removing barriers in gifted education. So we'll go through a little bit about how I arrived at this place in my career and why culturally and linguistically diverse gifted students are an area of focus for me. Also talking about using data, specifically demographic data, to support equitable identification and programming practices across the state of Colorado. And then also talking about how giftedness manifests in different groups and why it's important to be broad and flexible in our gifted identification practices. So those are going to be our topics for tonight. So I'll start by talking a little bit about my journey. I think, again, as Randy said, I'm in my 44th year of being gifted. Growing up gifted is not easy. I was an early enterer into kindergarten and never really felt like I found my people or like I belonged anywhere until I got to college. So the term gifted was never explained to me. And I know that we had a question from a viewer who submitted a question via survey regarding examples of students having more positive peer interactions and calming down once they discover that, or they learn more about their giftedness. And I'm an example of the opposite of that. So I did not know anything about what it meant to be gifted, and it really had a lot of negative effects on my life. So knowing who you are and why you might feel things more intensely than peers is really important, especially in the middle school and high school years. Also understanding that gifted does not equal smarter, gifted does not equal better, but understanding that your brain does work differently would have presented or prevented a lot of issues for me around handling failures, accepting challenges, perfectionism, and my competitive nature. So I think it is absolutely essential that once we identify gifted kids, we explain to them what it really means so that they can kind of use that throughout the rest of their life. So I, because of heightened sensitivity and being an intense person and growing up in a really small town, I got out of school as soon as I could by graduating early. I accidentally wrecked my car and I took the insurance check and decided that I was going to start traveling and kind of searching for where my place might be. So these are some of the places that I traveled in my life, and a really pivotal moment was I ended up in Spain doing an exchange program, and it was everything. It was my junior year of college, and everything was in Spanish. So sitting in the back of a classroom learning about literature of the Golden Century or Baroque art history, and I did not have the vocabulary that I needed. I did not have the community support that I needed. I really sat in the back of class every day waiting for it to be over and really, really hoping that the teacher would not call on me. So that humiliation and embarrassment of not knowing the language or the culture was really formative and kind of informed my path moving forward. So another example of that is I remember going home one day and I had been traveling around a lot. You could get really cheap plane tickets in and out of Spain. So traveling around, and I came home and told my two Spanish roommates that I was a gypsy, and the word gypsy is gitana. And I thought that was kind of a sexy word, right? And that would be a good thing. Not knowing that that word in that particular culture in northern Spain is not a good thing to be. right? So immediately creating this divide between my roommates and I, and it just started this journey of empathy building around what it feels like to really be walking alone in a world where you don't understand the social norms or you don't understand the language and the culture. So that's a really big part of my journey. So after coming back from that, I did not finish the year on that semester or that year abroad. I came back because it was too much and I quit and came back, finished my career and became a teacher. So a couple years in, I had the opportunity to get my master's in literacy, language, and culture. So that built upon that experience in Spain. And again, it was a formative experience in my path moving forward. So next on that journey is motherhood. And at that time I was teaching second grade and couldn't stay in the general education classroom while mothering. It was too much and too intense. Again, being highly sensitive and looking at this little baby and looking at this class and not really being able to balance all of that. I was looking for something else to do. And a family friend of mine was in the gifted position at the school that I worked in and ready to retire and suggested that I go down that route. So I got into gifted ed, which was, again, at the age of 30, I finally was told what it meant to be gifted and really started to learn about just the nuances of that and the strengths and the challenges and the positives and the negatives, and really finding people who thought about things in the same way that I did. So again, that sense of belonging and really finding my people. So when I got into gifted education, I was told right up at the beginning by that family friend that it was always going to be a battle, that it was a rewarding and amazing career, but that I was always going to be fighting for kids who didn't necessarily have a voice, fighting for kids who were misunderstood. And at the time, it seemed like a really amazing challenge. And now 14 years in, it's still an amazing challenge. But being in a field that's seen as elitist weighs really heavy on me. And I quickly started looking for ways to myth bust and change perceptions around gifted education. So those myths relate to the idea that gifted kids are going to be fine, that they're smart enough to navigate any system without needing extra support. Also, the demographic makeup of the gifted kids in my school and district did not mirror the general population. And that was a sticking point for me. And then also just a firm belief that I could change individual student lives by increasing access and opportunity for all students. I love this quote. If you guys haven't read this book as well, Homegoing, very, very powerful. But the big idea here, obviously, is that the people who have the power get to write the story, right? So understanding that I was coming from a place of privilege and trying to figure out how to use that voice for good. So again, that desire for change and wanting to make the field of gifted education more inclusive. Also marrying those two fields together. I now had a master's in literacy, language, and culture, and another one in gifted ed, and looking for the clear overlaps there. So always, I've had this kind of restless desire to roam, like wanderlust, my whole life. There's a Spanish word that really describes it much better, I think, than English. It's inquietos, which is just kind of unquiet. I can't really settle in very long in any one place. So wanting to create change. And using my sense of humor and knowledge about gifted education, and then also just speaking at it from a first person perspective, decided that I really wanted to work more on developing professional development for teachers and working with them on understanding the traits of giftedness. So oddly enough, I'm also an introvert who, as long as I'm talking about gifted education, can be very extroverted. So I don't mind being on stage, but it has to be talking about gifted ed. Everything else, I'll crawl back in my shell. So I used to travel around a lot doing in-person trainings. And then with COVID, everything had to change course. And I needed to move trainings and content online and make them self-paced, which actually has resulted in being able to reach a lot more people. So again, kind of time to change the world, right? I saw a problem in gifted ed, and there are a lot of other people around our state and our nation and our world who are also seeing those inequities and really wanting to shift, but not knowing how to do that. So I started by identifying the barriers. So one barrier is not using the data that we have in appropriate ways. We do a lot of assessment in school, and we don't need to add assessment, nor do we need to take it away, but just be more clever about how we're using those assessments. So again, we're testing not always the right things, not always what we want the kids to know. Another barrier is there's a lot of bias that can be in the testing instruments that you use, in the educators that are working with students, and just in the systems as a whole. We definitely tend to make generalizations and stereotypes about what kids are capable of. And I am very guilty of that. So recognizing that it was a barrier for myself and that I had a lot of work to do around that. That leads again to misunderstanding about giftedness, that it doesn't just mean high achievement. It doesn't mean that you're going to be fine. It doesn't mean that you're going to be successful anywhere, but given the right tools and instruments, you can do anything that you want. The sky's the limit there. But knowing that there needed to be more education around what it meant to be gifted. And that comes to a lack of training, right? We are so pressed for time in this field, and there are a million special populations that need your attention, and there are a million initiatives, and there are a million assessments, and all of those things are kind of jockeying for time and really needing to be loud about gifted education, needing the light shine on it, at least for a moment. So start by identifying the barriers. And again, if you're trying to create change in your system, you've got to figure out what your barriers are, and then the ones that you can address and the ones that you don't have any control or influence over. So again, coming back to that idea of power and who holds the power. So one thing that I've learned is that data talks, and when people can't necessarily connect to you on an emotional level, they can understand the data and they can understand the numbers. So those of you who have been around for a while, this is a familiar graph, right? So looking at our state and local data, not for the purposes of recruitment, but to see gaps and identify areas for improvement. So there's a lot of information here. This is our state data, and I didn't drill down any smaller than that, but you can see that third column, the AU percent. So those are the percentages of subgroups of the entire student population. Those are the percentages that exist in the subgroups. So for example, I'm going to go down, well, let's just start with male and female. So across our state, of the 400 and I can't see the student count because my notes are in the way, but 51.4% of our students are male, and 48.6% of the students statewide identify as female. So then when you look over in the far right-hand column and you look at the GT percent, in a perfect world, if we were well represented everywhere, those numbers would match. So if 51.4% of the students in the state of Colorado are male, you would hope that 51.4% of the students in the gifted population were also male. So anywhere that you see a mismatch or a discrepancy between those two numbers is somewhere that we're not equally and equitably representing student body. So again, the numbers don't lie. This is transparent. I've pushed back and forth, with a lot of different people on sharing this data and not sharing this data and what the consequences of sharing the data is. And I think that if we don't really look at the hard numbers and understand that this is the mountain ahead of us that we need to climb, right? We want those columns to match. If 7/10 of our students are Native American, it should be 7/10 of the gifted population, not 3/10, right? So one thing that I hear a lot is, there's not a lot of diversity in our region, or we don't have Hispanic or Latinx students here. Every region has special populations, and in every region, there are populations that are being left behind and not well represented. So again, this kind of leads to, what do you do with the data and how can you use this to create change? So another example of this, if you look back at that state data, I'm looking here at the free and reduced lunch. So those are students who qualify for free and reduced lunch or who live at or below the established poverty line. And in our state, 40.7% of the students qualify for free and reduced lunch. But if you just look at the gifted students, 16.4% of them qualify for free and reduced lunch. So there's an obvious mismatch and an obvious discrepancy there, right? We're never going to have an exact equal match, but we've got to bring those numbers closer together again so that our gifted students are mirroring our general population. We know that giftedness exists across cultures. So just take a minute to think about where you live, and you can start small. You can start with your school, you could go to your district, or you could go to your administrative unit or your region or even your state and think about what those microcultures are, right? So it could be race and ethnicity, it could be gender, it could be free and reduced lunch, it could be English language learners, it could be migrant students from migrant families. Just think about what those microcultures are and challenge yourself to go and see if they are well represented within your gifted numbers. So again, you can't say we don't have CLD students or we aren't diverse here, right? Because again, the students qualifying for free and reduced lunch exists across our state, no matter where you are. So we all have different groups of students that we can focus on. So that brings me to multiple pathways, right? So looking beyond our traditional guidelines and criteria and cut scores and markers for gifted, and to see how we could maybe look at that in a little bit different way. So I know this is a long quote. I'm going to just give you a minute to read it. So kind of circling back around to that idea of bias in our assessment tools and in our instruments that we're using. So one thing that kept coming up over and over again with other gifted educators is the use of access data. And teachers really wanted to know why it was only considered as referring data and why it couldn't be used as qualifying data. So this came up consistently at one meeting after one gathering after the other for years. And educators from the field of gifted education joined forces with CLD teachers and CLD staff members from the Department of Ed to inquire into the possibility of using those access scores and creating guidelines that could be used for qualifying data to support the identification of English learners. And that has been a really huge focus professionally for the last few years. So as Miranda said, we put together a cohort that was people from urban and rural areas, people from gifted education, people from EL, CLDE, just to put our minds together and think about, again, there's this barrier there that we only should use this for referring data, but why does this exist? So after a lot of brainstorming and research and a change in leadership at the state level, we were able to create guidance. And Miranda, if he is going to drop the state guidance for using access scores into our chat room so you guys can see that. That includes guidance and frequently asked questions. So one thing to note about this guidance is that it wasn't perfect when we started. There were a couple years of brainstorming that went into this, and there were multiple iterations, and it took a leader who was willing to just say, let's put it out there and see if it works. So if you're somebody that's in an administrative or leadership position in your district, you can't wait for all the stars to align. We don't have time for that. So while we are sitting here trying to get everything to line up and make sure that everything is perfect, students are just continuing to move through the system and not be recognized for their gifts that they bring. So there is a point when you just have to put it out there and see how it works. So again, the guidance that Miranda put in the chat box is actually the third iteration. So we put it out in the fall and then did another revision in about January. And then you can see that the one that you have access to was revised again in March 3rd. So it's trying something to see if it works and then adjusting and being flexible. Again, if we're so rigid, like it can't come out till it's perfect, we're missing the boat there. So again, a key here is that we had support from administrators and leaders, and that makes a huge difference. And I also want to do a big shout out to Brad Russell in Mapleton. He was a huge part of this and really knows the instrument, the access tool inside and out. So lots of credit goes to him as well. So in addition to access testing, sorry, I'm going to go back a little bit. Important here is that there are 3 different kind of pathways that you can take through the access test. And these can all be used as qualifying data for gifted identification. So again, we're looking at proficiency levels. We're looking at accelerated trajectory through the program. Again, if you would predict that a student would come from newcomer to exit status in 6 years and they do it in 3, it means they are hustling double time. That is very, very difficult to do. And only about 3 to 5% of your English learners are going to be able to achieve that, which then aligns with kind of what we would typically think of as gifted. And then again, also your growth percentiles. So there are 3 different data points that you can use. And the purpose here is that access is given annually to all of the English learners in the English Learner program across the state. So instead of just using it to identify what students can do in reading, writing, listening, and speaking, we are also using that data for dual purpose. And we're working across departments and sharing information so that it's not that the EL department gets the access scores and then the gifted department works over here. But the big idea is that we really work together there. In addition to access testing, which is a dry assessment of language proficiency, right? We also have these more conceptual and more abstract ideas, which is that there are different ways of knowing, and giftedness looks different across different cultural groups. It has evolved across time. People have different ways of solving problems, of communicating, learning, right? Using symbols. And we know that giftedness is about so much more than achievement. And achievement and academic ability spans way beyond reading, writing, and math. So it's about broadening your horizon and looking at things in a little different way. So when we think about gifted identification and the buckets of data that we collect, anecdotal information, observational data, work samples, portfolio samples, things that align to all of these different ways of being and doing and knowing can be used for in the demonstrated performance or performance evaluation bucket, right? So it's not that we need to just focus on cognitive ability and achievement, but really look at how these students are walking in the world. Who are they? Not who are they on a flat piece of paper, but really what are their different ways of knowing and how does that manifest in the classroom? So one way to do that is to share traits lists, and Miranda is going to drop my 2 favorite ones into the chat box. Again, we know that giftedness manifests in different ways across different groups, right? So taking these traits lists and sharing them with families and sharing them with educators and sharing them with community members and asking them to look at students in a little bit different light and to examine both positive and negative manifestations of giftedness is really important. So at the end, I'll share my email. I have a whole folder full of these. These are the 2 that the varied faces one is new to me and I really like it. It's long, but it's extensive. It includes twice exceptionality. And then the 12 traits of giftedness is also, it's an oldie but a goodie, and it's been revised to include students from culturally and linguistically diverse populations. So again, share these with your community members and seek referrals from alternate sources. Training educators right now is where all of my professional time and energy goes. So I mentioned before that I used to do a lot of in-person training and had to switch over in time of COVID, but leveraging state requirements for CLDE hours and looking for overlaps is another way to kind of get in the back door when people don't want to hear about gifted and they don't want to give it the time. you can come in at different angles, right? So educators across the state of Colorado are required to have 45 hours of training in cultural and linguistic diversity. So why not mesh something with that keeps the bar really high, pushes the ceiling, maintain high expectations for your learners. And you can learn about those two things in tandem, which is a benefit to all of your learners. So again, moving to an online format has resulted in close to 500 educators statewide being trained, either in the use of access scores for identification or in how CLD students can be identified as gifted and how we can provide access and opportunity within the school setting. So identifying the barriers in your system and working around them. If you don't have time for a whole PD day, if you don't have time for an entire PLC, but you have time for an hour in your jammies on the couch whenever you want, then do it in that format. Switch it up so that you can reach the most people. That is what turns educators into advocates. So thinking about the role of educators as advocates, particularly when we're talking about diverse gifted students, you need to know the audience and connect, right? So really, again, looking at what are those microcultures in your class and what do they need, and connecting with students individually. There are a lot of strategies and tools and tips and tricks and games that you can use to connect with your students, but really knowing who they are. Also being a critical consumer of resources. I know this is a hot topic right now with critical race theory, and is it included in curriculum and is it not? But aside from that, looking at the resources that you use and how they present students in different cultures. Are they in a place of honoring? Are they in a place of minimizing? Are they isolating? But really think about the tools that you're using with students. Using strategies that are not so language dependent, right? And looking for the student that does something different and does something unexpected. We tend to have a basic set of standards that we look for in students, but again, looking for the outlier. Who's doing something a little bit different? Who has the response that's unexpected? I mentioned this just a bit ago, but maintaining high expectations for all students. We do not drop the bar. We do not change the criteria. We do not lower the cut scores because student is learning English or qualifies for free and reduced lunch. The bar is high. The expectations are high, and we provide the tools to get there. So this is a really big one. I mentioned it before when talking about power, but managing your own social emotional response to diversity and to potential. Do you have a belief that that gifted is just about nurture and it comes when families are more privileged and have more access and opportunity? Or do you believe that giftedness exists everywhere and just needs to be nurtured? I think this is a hot one, and we really have to reflect and look at our own junk and look at our own stuff if we want to grow and move forward. So when we think about cultural values and how they manifest in the classroom and how they affect and collide with our traditional education systems, all of these things, this is just a short list of cultural values, right? So ideas around time, right? You may think that the student that's coming in late is the rudest thing you've ever seen, but different students have different temporal orientation and a different idea about that. It's not necessarily about being respectful or disrespectful. And I know that we want to set standards and play by common sets of rules, but there are a lot of different ways of being here. So thinking about when you think about gifted as being those outliers, right? Being the tail on the bell curve, how does that also interact with all of these different cultural values? This is one of my favorite quotes and favorite pieces of art. So really coming down from the branches and really looking at what the roots are. What are the roots of your students, right? Not just the stuff that's loud, not just the stuff that's abrasive and obnoxious in the classroom, right? But what are their roots? What matters to them? So what's up next, right? Well, after you identify your barriers, after you have come so far on your journey, and if you get to a place where you have a voice and you have a platform and you want to use it, You need to learn as much as you can, and you need to teach others. Do a lot of listening, and I would say listening to students. I oftentimes wish that I could go back into the general education classroom now that I don't have small babies and really listen to my students, because I don't think I did that. I definitely felt that I was a giver of knowledge. So listening to what the students want. Today, I had an ALP training in my region, and there were a lot of questions coming at me about, what about this goal? What about that goal? And my response is frequently like, you just ask the student what they want. Do they want this or that? Do they want to go down this road? Do they want to stay on this path? Right? But really listening and using your voice to be loud, loud advocates for gifted students, particularly gifted students who are underrepresented and don't have the same access and opportunity. It's not okay. So doing a lot of fumbling and growing, and that's part of it as well. So again, when you're removing barriers and running headlong into walls, you're going to fumble and you're going to make mistakes, and having a lot of humility and connecting with your administrators and your leadership will create change for students. So there's my email. If you guys want more trace lists, if you want more information about access, if you want information about coursework, again, I have a ton of different things that are self-paced. Just shoot me an email and I will definitely respond. So that's my little spiel. Now we can talk about questions, which is awesome.
All right. Well, thank you. I always enjoy listening to you speak. And I always just like nod my head like, yes, yes, preach. I received, you already addressed one of the questions, and I'm pulling up.
Oh, I have it in my head. I do.
In your head, you're so.
Can I go for it? So a second question that came in today was what to do with students and how to support them when they move from work being too easy to work being too hard. And that's hard for gifted kids, right? Particularly gifted kids who are used to things being pretty easy. So it's going to feel uncomfortable. So my response to that is to equate effort with success and not intelligence with success. So you're not successful because you were born smart, right? It's about how hard you're working, how you're listening, and how you're growing. So also helping gifted students understand that true learning happens when things are just a little bit out of reach, right? We think about that zone of proximal development. You want things just a little above your head and a little bit hard. And so it's okay. It's okay that things are hard. If things are not easy, you're not growing and you're not learning. And that's going to get old really fast. So also if a student moves to a place where the work is too hard or really challenging, just as teachers would for any other students, they need to scaffold for the gifted students. If the work is too hard, what does the student need? Do they need more time? Do they need vocabulary? Do they need graphic organizers? Do they need it presented in a different way? Do they need more practice? So again, coming back to that whole idea of listening, talk to the student and try to figure out why things are difficult. Are they difficult because they just don't want to? Are they difficult because there really is a disconnect there? And then use the team problem solving approach to come up with solutions. So I think really asking the student, like, this is really hard for you, and why do you think that is, can help address solutions.
Awesome. Yeah, I've always found I've always been so much more successful in helping a student when they're part of the solution instead of having a solution being imposed upon them. So
yeah, like we write ALPs in isolation and we make decisions in isolation. And so frequently, I'm like, just ask the kid, what does the kid think? What do they want? So yeah, they've got to be involved even from a young age.
Yeah, for sure. And it's that relevance piece, right? We say it all the time. We have another question from Jen Strickland. And it was when you were talking about using Access as an assessment tool that we could use for identification rather than in isolation using it for ELL. And she asked kind of questioning, what about those kiddos who might be twice exceptional or who are maybe not high achievers. And you kind of addressed it, and I'm going to say what I took down, and then you can expand upon it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you went to the other ways of knowing, and you mentioned it's not just about cognitive ability and achievement, and there's other pathways. Maybe you can expand on how possibly, you know, there twice exception, if giftedness exists in all cultures, so does twice exceptionality.
Mm-hmm.
So how, and so does it, so do executive functioning challenges and all those other things. So how can we find those individuals from maybe our English learner populations and our culturally diverse populations?
Well, so this is like a triply tricky question, right? Because we know that CLD students are overrepresented in special education and underrepresented in gifted education. So I will come back to the demonstrated performance. There is something that kid is nailing. Like there is something that they are doing right. And you may have to go to dinosaurs, right? Or wolves, whatever they're interested in, and find out what they're doing in that interest area, in that strength area, and notice it and collect evidence. So that, again, work samples, anecdotal data, those things can be used as performance evaluation and demonstrated performance. And we overlook it all the time. A portfolio doesn't just mean like a little binder full of stuff, right? It can be kind of a living thing. So I think when you're talking about twice exceptionality, it's hard in the realm of special ed because it's focused, in my experience, a lot on deficits, and we are looking for strengths. So I think, again, identifying what the student does well, providing them more opportunities within the school day to do that thing and practice that thing, and then collecting evidence. And it could be pictures, it could be sticky notes, it could be self-reflections. But all of those things can be quantified, and all of those things can be used in performance evaluation. And I think we forget about that. So again, like I said, we're not going to drop the bar and change the criteria. But think about if, for example, if you have a twice exceptional student who didn't have a qualifying cognitive ability score, well, was it a group administered test? Or do they need to have it with one-on-one? Do they have an accommodation on assessments? And were they given that accommodation when they took the universal screening test? I can tell you, I've given many a universal screen without noticing the accommodations. Now I don't do that, but I did when I started. And then you find out that 5 of the kids have time accommodations and they didn't get that. So if you believe that they're gifted and the cognitive ability score is not reflective of what you know they can do, then think about how it was administered and how it was given and who gave it and what the mood was when the test was given and all of the environmental factors that go in, and you can reassess using a different instrument. So that's what I would say is look at the conditions that the assessment was given in, and then also find out what that student does well and bump it up.
Okay, we got questions rolling in. Good job on that one. Jen followed up really quickly, and we'll address this one. I'll address it a little bit here. And what do you do to combat language differences to find those one thing they're doing great? In my experience, it has been finding a translator and talking to the parents or talking to people who are like their soccer coach or their church leader or something like that. What are some other tips, Nisia, that you might have when language difference makes it a challenge for you to do that investigation? What are some avenues that you've gone to find students in that way?
Okay, I'm taking notes down. So I think that you mentioned looking at like communicating with the family. That's a really big one, right? And if you don't have resources, if you're in a small area and you don't have resources to translators, you need to go out, right? Either your BOCES or a bigger district, find a translator that can work with you to talk. I think, again, seeking referrals from community members is huge. Coaches, people who work at Boys and Girls Club, YMCA, after school programs, they see those kids in a different light and those kids act and behave in different ways. Providing opportunity in the school day for them to do activities that are not language dependent. This is everything in our schools is text-based, everything, either reading or writing. Absolutely everything is literacy language-based. There isn't a literacy skill that you can't teach first through images. So for example, if you were teaching drawing conclusions, rather than just sit there and talk at them and have them read a text and then tell you what conclusions they drew, put up a picture and have the kids discuss the picture, right? There are so many ways to use visuals and things that are do not have a heavy language load. And when you stand back and you give the kids an opportunity to practice the skill in a nonverbal way, in a way that is using visuals and images and actions rather than relying completely on text, you'll see something different, right? So again, I feel like we should take every single literacy skill and teach it first in a nonverbal and highly visual way. And then you can build that way of thinking and that way of operating. And then you can layer the language and literacy and text on top of it. But we have to not be so, the term that I've heard lately is graphocentric. It's this graphocentrism. Everything in our world it's like reading has this heavy, prize. If you're a good reader and if you read a lot, it's like you're the best person on the planet. So taking language out of it.
Awesome. Well, thank you. We have a follow-up from Jen, but we'll get back to that because we have a couple other questions I want to address. Bernadette Jessica says, which models do you recommend schools use to guide their gifted programs, referencing Gagne's, Renzulli? What is there any one that you tend to feel aligns best with CLD gifted kiddos?
No, but wait, hold on. I have to write something down. Okay. Otherwise, I'll forget what I'm thinking. Okay, so I think that subscribing to one model is not my favorite thing for a couple of different reasons. First, I think it can kind of pigeonhole you. And then secondly, I find a lot of models, you pay a lot of money to be like a this school or that school, and you can create a hybrid on your own as long as you are doing it with fidelity. So 3 things that I would say I really feel like are programming models that would work for across cultures. First of all is concept-based teaching. So if you come out of an IB school, you'd be familiar with that. If you use depth and complexity framework, you'd be familiar with that. But I really, especially with gifted kids, they can think conceptually and think globally. So tying instruction to big concepts like power, conflict, connection, leadership, systems, things like patterns, is something that you can do across with all of your students, and it will elevate everything for the gifted students and help them see connections. I also think that there is no reason that you need to pull out the special Bluebird group and do this stuff with them over here that nobody else gets that rich instruction. I do believe in school-wide, not necessarily in the school-wide enrichment model, but doing things with all students and giving all the students the access and opportunity, because you don't know where the kids are hiding. If you're making assumptions based on achievement measures or even cognitive ability, then you're not giving those opportunities to other kids. So I do think that if we had really strong tier 1 universal instruction using best practices from gifted education with all students, it would be amazing. And again, that works on, and then that was my 3rd thing, is just talent development, is just flood kids with the opportunity to think and grow in different ways. And I do believe that all kids should have access to that. But I also believe that there are a small group of students who will do something really different. And they need to be seen as well. But concept-based teaching, that's like my jam.
And I had this exact same conversation with our community college cohort today, and talking about serving kiddos and saying the exact same thing. If you provide the opportunities to everybody, the kids that will reach out for those opportunities, whether regardless of gifted identification status or not, are the kids that you want to be looking at and say, oh, they're seeking this. So there's something there. There's a spark, there's an interest that we need to foster. And maybe if we dig a little deeper, we'll find those gifted kids. But we have to open those doors and those pathways for the access and opportunity.
Yeah, and I don't ever want gifted to be a gatekeeper for anything, a gifted identification. I've been having a lot of conversations about acceleration policies and entrance into advanced programming. And Jonathan Plucker wrote an amazing article that's posted on the NAGC site about, hold on, it's on my phone, about entrance requirements. If a kid wants to, let them, let them in. What is the worst thing that could happen is that you let them in and it doesn't fit and then they move back. And if you talk about that at the beginning, like, hey, we're going to give you this opportunity, we're going to give you all the structures and support we can, it might not work. Let's give it 6 weeks. You need to maintain this average, After that time, if it doesn't work, we're going to move you back. That's the worst thing that could happen.
And it goes back to listening to the student. If they're selecting and they want the challenge and they're seeking that challenge, then if you're not letting them rise to that, then any lack of success they have is on you and not on them.
Yep. So again, that's teacher fear. I had a long talk with several regional coordinators today about this, about just flexibility and that loss of control for content specialists and general educators. It's very, we want to make sure that we are responsible for teaching all these standards and they learned it from us. And it's really hard to think about a student testing out of your class before you've even gotten a hold of them. That's a hard thing, but it's okay. It's okay. So the article that I was referring to is actually a blog post. So automatic enrollment is a promising equity strategy for advanced education. And it was on August 16th of this year. So I recommend everybody read that.
If we can,
it talks about, if you have the ganas, right? If you have the will, go.
Absolutely. Hector, he is our friend from Puerto Rico, and we've got someone from Malaysia on tonight, Eileen. She's one of our super fans. We love having her on, and Hector's on again tonight, and he asked, what kind of activities can we use for extremely perfectionist youth? And we may need to kind of, I'm not 100% sure what he means by activities, but maybe things that we can do to help address perfectionism in our adolescent kiddos.
So for perfectionism, I think as far as something that you can do in your classroom environment is work really, really hard to set up a place where it's safe to fail. That takes a lot of work, and that is setting up a classroom culture. So, and it's easier said than done. I think we can say, oh, my kids can fail in this environment, but really making sure that they have low risk opportunities to butt up against their perfectionism. I think bibliotherapy is a really good tool. There's a lot of really awesome books, very short books about perfectionism. I think Free Spirit Publishing has some what to do when good isn't good enough. There's a lot of those. And I think that instead of, again, and I know we're pressed for time, but instead of handing those books to the teacher, the student and saying, here, go read this with your family and talk about it, do a book group and do a book study so that they can see that other people are going through the same thing. That's when it's powerful, is when there is a group of peers around talking about that. But anxiety and perfectionism is definitely real. There's some awesome online, I'm sure you could just Google like perfectionism quizzes for kids. Again, they can take that, they can get kind of a general idea and then talk about it. Not necessarily normalizing perfectionism, because it's not good, but talking about the fact that you're not alone. Another good strategy, I think, always is looking at famous failures, right? That kids love that. There's a million things on athletes who failed 14 times, right? Michael Jordan, just if you Google famous failures, there's a YouTube video that is awesome. And it just goes through all of these famous people over history and how they totally bombed and totally failed. So I think just talking about it. But bibliotherapy is a big one too, whether it's fiction or nonfiction.
I agree. I love reading.
I know.
It's like
what to do when good isn't good enough is such a good one. It's so tiny too. You can start with it in 3rd grade.
And then the next question I'm popping around because I'm scrolling and I'm like, okay, what? Somebody said how to be perfect person in just 3 days. Was that an
Oh,
article?
that must be maybe a book title.
Uh, there's an article.
Mm-hmm.
It just may be a side conversations that's happening.
What is it called?
That I'm trying to follow. Anyway, another question is about high WIS scores. Kara Reindeer says, what about high WIS scores and not as high on the school administered scores? And I'm wondering why if they've got a high WIS score but not high school administered scores, why are we asking them to jump through so many hoops?
You don't have to.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obvious, like it's frequent that you will get one score on a CAGT or a NAT and a totally different score on the WISC. Mm-hmm. Again, I think some of it has to do with administration because the WISC is a one-on-one administrator. It's also given by somebody that's, got the type Z license or, whereas CAGT can be administered by anybody and frequently is administered by a gen ed teacher who's just been voluntold that she needs to do that with
and
her class.
Thing we've been guided to is to not look at the full scale IQ sometimes on that WISC because the processing speed could almost be 2 to 3 standard deviations for gifted kiddos.
So I cannot think of this off the top of my head, but this is an NAGC has a position paper. It's just Google NAGC WISC position paper, and it will tell you which sections they recommend using and which ones to eliminate. Because again, especially with twice exceptional kids, working memory and processing speed, we don't want them to interfere. That's again why when you are giving cognitive ability, you got to make sure they get their accommodations. But so look up that position paper because it talks about which sections to eliminate or not. But if a kid has a 95th percentile or above in the recommended subsections of the WISC, they do not need to do another cognitive. Yeah. You've got the cognitive. So that is something, again, when we talk about crossing departments, sharing access scores, sharing universal screening scores, sharing the data that comes out of IEP eval process. Mm-hmm. Because if your school psych or your SPED educator doesn't know to look for those things as markers of gifted, they know, oh, they're advanced and yada, yada, yada. But reaching out to them so that they know that if they see something, and I would say in the 80th percentile or above, they have to contact a gifted person. Anything in the 95th or above is a qualifier. Anything below would be supportive. But man, why would you reassess kids? That's again, using data wisely.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
It's just sitting there.
And again, a lot of our kids, especially our 2E kids, might show on a cognitive, especially like a nonverbal, visual spatial assessment of cognitive reasoning and not be demonstrating it in the classroom. Yep. I think of a student, that may have been in a special education program for several years and be receiving special education services, but all of a sudden was like displaying these traits, gets a great cognitive score, but he's not going to score well academically because he hasn't been being served with the higher level of academic expectations, possibly the way they've been grouped.
Yeah, if a kid never gets access to advanced instruction, why would you expect that they would score in the 95th percentile or above on an achievement test? Like that's about access to that knowledge. You don't wake up knowing all of those facts about science. Like that's about, were you exposed to that? So some of the most accurate referrals I've ever gotten come from special ed teachers because they know their students. They know them, like they are their babies and they spend a lot of time with them and they can see it. I think our state does a really good job of recognizing and looking for twice exceptionality. And I think we're getting better at that.
Absolutely.
But the same thing, if you don't think a kid on an IEP is capable of scoring at high levels, that's teacher bias. Same thing, if you think a kid is learning English or qualifies for free and reduced lunch and therefore is not capable of learning at high levels, that we have to reflect. I mean, I've made so many biased and terrible decisions and I'm growing.
Yep,
and it hurts.
And just as our last recap, because I think this is a good way to end, because you talk about bias. We talk about bias with students on IEPs. We talk about bias with students who are ELL. We talk about implicit bias. I mean, I think we all have implicit biases because of our, just our epistemological, how we know what we know, and we come from our cultures, and then we have to figure out that there's other places and other cultures out there and ways of knowing. Jen says, what about cultures that maybe came from, I think about more recent immigrants from Central America, who maybe came from educational programs that were maybe minimal, didn't address gifted programs, that don't maybe recognize academic giftedness. So how do we make sure those kids aren't left behind? And kind of as a follow-up, I think it's all the same. How do we address then bias too in our teachers and educators? Because it's not that it's intentional, but it exists. Mm-hmm. And my comment to Jen would be, it is about people like you and I and all the wonderful people that we work with through the CDE, speaking out and being vocal, but also making sure that we're sharing information with our communities and having community outreach and not living in our silos, which you've been talking about all night long, about getting out of our silos and sharing information and sharing access and opportunity. So I'd like you to add to kind of that as kind of our recap of how do we combat lack of knowing, lack of understanding, and also those implicit biases that exist within our systems.
So I will just come back to education, and not just education for teachers, but education for families and communities and administrators and teachers about what it means to be gifted. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I get so far down the road because we've been doing this for a long time, and I'm like jumping so far down, in the grant that we're working in together. It's like, we'll back up. We need to just start with basic understanding. Gifted kid. I mean, for some people, saying that a gifted kid may be highly sensitive or maybe intense is like, mind blowing. So pick a couple characteristics that are important and relevant and can be seen across cultures and share those widely. There are a lot of families that don't want their kids to be identified as gifted because that would elevate them. Mm-hmm. It would put them into a different status, and they don't want that. Why would I want my kid to stand out? Why would I want that to, so I think explaining the benefits of gifted, and to me, it's not about academic access. It's about self-understanding and knowing who you are. And that is, knowing who you are and how you tick is important no matter what culture you're in. So just sharing. Those traits lists are a good place to start, putting them in, giving them to your teachers and putting them in your teacher boxes, and just change perception just a tiny bit. And then put a different one in the next month and change it just a little bit, bit by bit.
I think also just making those questions, talking about casting a wide net and all the different pathways that the CDE that we've been working on for so long, and offering, world languages. Do people on here know that we identify for world languages? Do people know that we identify for psychomotor and dance?
Well, that's what I was going to say. Of the 14 areas, only 5 of them are academic.
Exactly.
Right? Reading, writing, math, science, and social studies. All of the rest of them are more nebulous, or, but that is where you're going to capture students who are coming in from different places.
And what might be a great follow-up on this, because we are out of time tonight, but I think that people who were interested really, especially in this assessment conversation and how these gatekeeper assessments and Colorado, we've been talking about, I feel like for like 5, 6, 10 years, we've been talking about stop using tests as a gatekeeper. So
I know, I was like, I don't really want to talk about assessment. I'd rather talk about universal instruction or talent development.
So if you're interested in that, in the assessment piece, because Nisia is all about, concept-based instruction and universal instruction. Yes. But if you're interested in assessment, we have Angelina, and I'm going to butcher this last name, so my apologies, Pelosa, who is addressing an introduction to addressing fairness and ability tests. She, I think, is on part of the development of the new NNAT, the NNAT.
Yes. And I will make a little plug for my region that they did come down and do, they worked with a bunch of students in Ignacio last year on and included them in the norming sample so that we've got more Native American students. So bit by bit.
Yes. And
but her talk would be awesome.
Including representative cultures in our norming samples is enormous and such a huge stride. So she is coming on next week. Same time at 5 o'clock. Next Tuesday, she'll be with, I believe, Mark Hess, who is our president-elect of NAGC, or of CAGT, my apologies. And I think it'd be a really good one to tune into, especially if you've enjoyed this conversation tonight. And we've had some great stuff. And Nisia, it's so good to see you. I can't wait to see you in person in a month. I'm so excited.
I know. It's going to be so good. It's going to be so good.
I'm tired of seeing my friends through Zoom screens. I know. This too. So folks, thank you again. Thank you for engaging in our conversation tonight and having these conversations. These are what we call gritty conversations. I love to have them. Nisia, thank you for joining us tonight. I hope that you can go outside, maybe enjoy some snowfall before the sun goes down.
I got some shoveling to do.
Yeah, right.
So weird.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us, everybody, tonight, and have a great evening. We'll see you tomorrow or see you next week.